Hello, and welcome to another Quarantine Sunday School. Topic for today's discussion is Alma chapters 53 through 63. So the war continues. So there's kind of more of the same from last week. Um, we were we're moving away from Captain Moroni and the title Liberty and into the Sons of Helaman. So a different narrative there. But still, we're in the middle of it. As I was reading through one of my commentaries, I almost forgot the word for commentary. It must be late. It basically took 43 through 63 and just said, we're not going to go into some details, but here's some macro topics that you might find interesting, or that you can learn as you start reading through those. And I picked out 5 of them. I thought they were some interesting things to watch for. If you start to kind of focus on a lens or use it as a primer, or whatever the term you want to use as. If you want to kind of look for these things, I think they're valuable lessons. Especially now, given the current climate that we have, the what's going on politically, what we see as a world climate, with the social economic upheaval, with conflicts across countries, whether that's China and India or the United States and China, whether that's whomever. There's a lot going on right now, and so relevant topics. The first topic that we see, and we see it a lot, especially in the 10 chapters that are on today's conversation, 53 to 63, is what should a believer's attitude about war be? It's an interesting question, and we see that in the attitudes of Moroni, of Lehi, of Helaman and the sons of Helaman. We see it with the anti-Nephi Lehis. We see the other side of the coin with the Lamanites and that whole crew, and kind of what they were looking to accomplish with this war as non-believers. We see the importance of having righteous military and political leaders. While we're in the middle of this war, there's a whole civil war that's happening, a war within the war between the Pehorn and the established government and the kingsmen, the people who want to replace the prime minister, right, the duly elected officials, and replace them with a king. And they were doing this funded by a political action committee known as the Lamanites, kind of thing, right? So there's a lot of subterfuge that's going on there as well. What should our attitude be towards the government of our land as presently constituted? How should we approach that? How should we affect change? What's the right way to go about things? Another topic is the power and influence of a righteous home, and how can that have an impact on the lives of our families, our progeny going on generations, and as well as the people that are around us. And then the 5th topic is one where I think it's easy to get bogged down in, and we see a lot of examples of people who are resolute. And the 5th topic is a circumstance should not determine our attitude or faithfulness. It's in the middle of trials and tribulations where we can become our best selves, when people can be their best self or not. And every day we get to make that choice, as we get up and we breathe and we start our day and we make a determination: am I going to be a righteous person or not? And so we see strife at its worst here. Significant combat within the Nephite side, combat with an actual enemy, the Lamanites, and combat within, just within a political struggle as well with their own people. So it's just everywhere you turn, and plenty of opportunities to pack it in, plenty of opportunities to give up, plenty of opportunities to, if we look at the Old Testament with Job, right, curse God and die, kind of thing. But that's not what the best of these people did. The Pehorans, the Teancums, the Lehis, the Moronis, the Helamans, the sons of Helaman, right? That's not what they did. And they overcame. And they came out the other side of this adversity better, stronger, faster, whatever. And so those are the opportunities that we have in front of us every day. And it's hard to see it when we're in the middle of it. It's hard to see it when we don't have that opportunity just to step back a little bit and to gain some perspective. I was talking to a young man who was going through a pretty significant health challenge, and it's created a lot of disruption in his life. And I told him, I said, because he was asking me, so he goes, I keep hearing that things happen for a reason, but I can't see what that reason is. And I said, you won't, not yet. I said, I promise you things happen for a reason, but sometimes you don't know what that reason is until later. Sometimes it's through the benefit of hindsight. Sometimes it's a trick of retrospect, that when we're ready for that reason, it will be manifest, and we'll look and we'll say, oh, yeah, I see that now. I can see it clearly. But when we're in the middle of it, it's hard to see that thing. And it's the metaphor that I've heard before, and what I explained to this young man was that if you put an elephant's trunk in the hands of a blind man and ask him to hold that trunk and describe what that animal looks like, they'll never get it right, because there's not enough data. We're too close. We only have just this little bit of information that he's able to glean through touching and feeling with his hands of one part of a massive animal. How can you describe the big picture when you haven't had a chance to step back for a minute, be still, think about it, and then understand? And so that was my advice to this young man, was that I promise you it'll come, but maybe not just yet. And be patient, take a step back, take it all in, and when you're ready, that lesson will be there for you. You will completely understand why it happened, and you will see the benefit of that experience. Just maybe not today. So that's what we see with the Lamanites and the Nephites, right, in this conflict. We see it well with the Nephites mostly, although the anti-Nephi Lehis, they were in there as well. The people of Ammon are mixed in, are interspersed, and there's some valuable lessons that they learned as well, and valuable lessons in that association. So if we start in 53, we're kind of in some of the logistics of war. One of the big things in a civilized war is, if you're going to take prisoners, those prisoners need to be taken care of, and that involves food. It involves people guarding them. It involves places to stay, and you look at these wildly successful military conflicts can be bogged down by the taking of prisoners. But that's the civilized thing to do. The other option is to have no quarter, right? To take no prisoners, because you can't afford people to look after them or care for them. And what we see, at least in this, is that they were mostly civilized. They were taking prisoners. The Nephites were only taking prisoners of warriors, of men. The Lamanites were taking prisoners of families, of everyone. As they were taking over towns, everyone was going to be prisoners. That included women and children, which goes against the Geneva Convention, but that didn't exist at the time. So what are you going to do? It does create some imbalance, as we'll see. There's there's conversations around epistles back and forth, letters back and forth around a prisoner exchange. And if you look at it and you say, well, neither one wanted to feed the other one's prisoners at this particular point in time. But if you do it on a one-for-one swap, one warrior for one child is not a fair exchange. And so you start to see some of those machinations going on as well. And then there's some really fun, great escape type of stories and things that I really enjoyed. But if we want to look at it, right, we see that they had the prisoners. They put the prisoners to work. Why? Because it's easier to guard prisoners when they're busy. And when they have things to do, they're not just going to sit around and start to plot escapes and become a problem. Also, free labor certainly helps as you're building out your defenses. And that's an important lesson as we look at verses 2 through 5, is in those moments of peace, prepare for war. In those moments of peace and quiet, shore up your defenses. And that can mean, literally, as in the case of the Nephites here, building ditches and walls and fortifications to make their cities safe from attack. Obviously the Lamanites didn't have siege engines and the things that you would need in order to take a fortified city. So if that city's fortified and if that city has enough provisions, food and water, they can't take it. And now you can outlast the enemy. If you don't have enough food and water, if the if the fortifications are weak, then your city ducks. And so you have to have this single-minded focus, and it's a moment of peace and quiet. That doesn't mean taking a long nap. That doesn't mean sleep in and don't do anything. It means work harder, because this is your moment to prepare. There's something, if we look at this as a metaphor for life, as you've heard me say this before, you'll hear me say it again, that in our lives, if we're not currently in the middle of a trial, in the middle of something, then we're headed out of one or headed into our next. That's the way life works. It's this big sine wave where we're in the middle of it, we come out of it, we're headed into our next one, we come out of it, we head into the next one. And that, that's just the nature of this life. When we have those quiet moments, that's when we need to strengthen ourselves, strengthen our own fortifications, put on the whole armor of God kind of thing, study, increase our testimony, work on our resiliency, get a year's supply of food, whatever that is that we need to shore up. Those are the times to do it, not when we're in the middle of the worst of it. We want to get that year's supply of food put away in those years of plenty, like Joseph in Egypt, rather than in trying to figure out how we're going to find food in those 7 lean years. And so that's what we can see here if we look at this as a metaphor. We find out the quality of Lehi in verse 2. There's kind of the heroes of this war, Captain Moroni, Lehi, and Teancum. We find out that Lehi, verse 2, he was a man like unto Moroni, and they rejoiced in each other's safety. Yea, they were beloved by each other, and also beloved by the people of Nephi. So they were kind of the heroes, the rock stars. But anybody who's been involved with any sort of combat situation, you saw it in the video that I linked to last week with the Henry V, and he talks about the band of Bews, band of brothers, and speaking about how because he shed his blood with me this day, be he ne'er so vile, this day will gentle his condition. There's this memory of, because we're together in it, because we're together facing this insurmountable foe, because we're frozen in foxholes in Baston, because we're fighting together in the jungles in Vietnam because we're wherever. Right? They lose this whole notion of king and country, and they gain this notion of that guy next to me. And that creates that bond that, that those of us who have not been in that situation will never understand, will never be able to experience. The closest I ever came was the sports teams, and it's not the same. I mean, you have this pulling together sort of thing in a common goal, but it's not life or death. It's fun. And so it's a very different context. And I see that as I read verse 2 here, that they rejoiced in each other's safety and they were beloved of each other. They had shared these life and death moments, and they cared deeply for each other, and they were completely connected by this bond that only warriors can understand. We see them again in verses 3 through 5. They're building up the cities. They're using in Bountiful. They're using the prisoners of war in order to have these strongholds, and we see the reasons for it. So I'm kind of just skipping ahead here, which we'll do quite a bit today instead of doing a deep dive and go through every word. Verse 7. It says, it came to pass that I'm talking about Moroni here, that he did no more attempt to battle with the Lamanites in that year, but he did employ his men in preparing for war, yea, and in making fortifications to guard against the Lamanites, yea, and also delivering their women and their children from famine and afflictions, and providing food for his armies. In ancient times, that there was a schedule for war. And it would happen after you planted the crops and then before you needed to harvest. And so that was a time, and it was like clockwork. It wasn't like now where you've got years and sometimes decades of peace. And I'm not talking about small sorts of police actions. I'm talking about like the big wars, and it can be years and decades. In this time, there was a time for war, and that's what it was. You go and you plant your fields, you go to war, you come back, and then you harvest your fields so that you've got enough food to get through so that you can do it all again the next year. And you even saw that with the Old Testament, when David got in trouble with Bathsheba, right? The line is, it was a time when kings went to war, but he didn't, kind of thing. And because that's what you do. You go and defend your territory, you expand your territory, whatever it is that is driving your, the interest of your particular country or kingdom or nation state. At the time of David, it was pushing the Canaanites out of the chosen land. In this case, it's the Nephites basically defending themselves against an armed incursion by an enemy who is bent on their total destruction. So, at this point, Moroni is like, well, we've got our cities fortified. We need to go harvest the fields so that we have food, so that the women and the children don't starve, so that we have food, so that we can go and attack and defend ourselves again next year. As part of that schedule of war. So again, in those moments of quiet, prepare, shore up your foundations. We see in verse 8 that there was some intrigue amongst the Nephites, and it does start to bubble up. We see this more through the course of the reading. They don't really tell us, a little bit coy about it here, but when you look at the worst possible scenario, when you're in the middle of a war for survival, you're battling against an enemy who is driving to kill you or subjugate you. I mean, those are the two options that they're considering. And now you've got an internal conflict. You've got a civil war going on in your homeland. it's difficult. As I thought about it, I thought, you know, in Russia during World War One, they were at war against the Germans and the Austro-Hungary Empire. Um, and during that process, they also had an internal conflict, the Civil War, where the Bolsheviks ended up deposing Tsar Nicholas II and then withdrawing from the war altogether. And it created a whole lot of confusion. You had people who were on the front trying to fight the enemy, and suddenly the enemy was no longer the enemy. There was a peace treaty. The Germans were able to free up their people and extended the war on the Western Front much longer because they no longer were trying to fight a two-front war. Even though the Russians were making a mess of it, they still had to hold an army there. They were still attacking, and it was creating a challenge. And so you look at this as the worst possible scenario, and it completely destroyed a centuries-old dynasty, because in that moment of conflict, in that moment of upheaval, suddenly there was a civil war that occurred. So that's kind of what we see with the Nephites as well. Different from trying to depose a monarchy, they were trying to restore a monarchy that hadn't been in place for years and years and years, since the time of Mosiah. So we've got that going on. We've one of the things that, and I think that you would see this in any culture, the anti-Nephi Lehi's, right, the people of Ammon, who are watching the Nephites just absolutely struggle to defend them, and to the point where they were ready to break their covenant with the Lord. They pick up arms and go to battle and pull their weight. Now, we saw last week they were pulling their weight as best as they could within the constraints of their covenant. And that means they were growing food and they were supplying materials, raw materials, to the army to support the war effort. And that's important. An army marches on its stomach. And we talked about this last week, the reason the United States was able to tilt the scale in World War II was they had a green army. They weren't super experienced at the beginning of the war, but what they had was a military industrial complex. They were able to take the Ford and Chevrolet assembly lines and flip them over and start making tanks and assault vehicles. They were able to push multiple ships out on a weekly basis, ship after ship after ship, those Liberty ships that they were making, that they were building in sections and welding together so they could bring supplies over. They were to England, through Hawaii into the Far East. So they were able to do so much more quickly that it put the enemies on the back foot. Germany, Italy, Japan were not able to compete with the military industrial complex of the United States in World War II. So that's an important thing to contribute. But what they see, at least this is my take on it, what they're seeing are the Nephite warriors who are going into harm's way and who are making the ultimate sacrifice to protect them. And there's a certain amount of guilt that they felt. There's stories even in World War II after Pearl Harbor when people were committing suicide when they were declared ineligible. It was a 4F, I think, when weren't able to serve because of some flat feet or a heart murmur, or whatever it was, and the guilt of not being able to go was too much to bear, and I can kind of see that as weighing on the people of Ammon. And it's one of those where, look, if you want it bad enough, you can find a solution. And the solution in verse 16 was that their sons had not entered into the covenant. And skipping down, therefore they did assemble themselves together at this time, as many as were able to take up arms. And they called themselves Nephites in verse 17. And they entered into a covenant to fight for the liberty of the Nephites. Yea, to protect the land unto the laying down of their lives, yea, Even they covenanted that they never would give up their liberty, but they would fight in all cases to protect the Nephites and themselves from bondage. So when you ask yourself, what is there anything worth dying for? According to these young men, it was liberty, and not just their own liberty, but the liberty of the Nephites. And the other thing to point out, I mean, we know the end, right? It's a famous story that they go and the sons of Helaman, they go into battle. Many pass out due to loss of blood, but none lost their lives over the course of that battle. But that's not what they thought at this point in time. That's not what they believed. They pledged to give their lives. So they were completely willing. They had no expectation that, well, because we're good people and because our moms love us, that we're going to get out of this unscathed. That doesn't happen in war. But they were ready to make that sacrifice because they were looking at it as giving up this one thing that I value for this other thing that I value more. This one thing that I value is their life. The one thing that they value more is their liberty. The liberty and freedom of not just them, but of these people who had protected them and their families for years. Verse 20, and they were all young men, and they were exceedingly valiant for courage and also for strength and activity. But behold, this was not all. They were men who were true at all times in whatsoever thing they were entrusted. Yea, they were men of truth and soberness, for they were taught to keep the commandments of God and to walk uprightly before him. Where did their power come from? Not just being young and strong. Those were the days, back when I was young and strong, but because they were valiant, they had courage, because they were taught to keep the commandments and walk uprightly before the Lord. And that's where their power and their strength came from. And that's a different kind of power. It's resiliency. It's not just a physical strength. It's a physical strength that's driven by something more. As I think about this, I think of that great movie from the '80s, The Chariots of Fire, and we had the English Olympic team, and there was one of the guys that was on it was a devout Christian, and he's and his speed came from not just the physicality of being able to run, but because when he ran fast, he felt God's love. And that was by far a greater motivation to him. And that's kind of what we see here. And I apologize, the name of it escapes me. But it's really, to me, the crux of the movie. He says, I love God, and he made me, but he made me fast. And when I run, I feel his pleasure. Different kind of motivation than just, I want to beat that person because I'm competitive, or, my country is right and your country is wrong. It's, walk uprightly before the Lord and keep his commandments. And that certainly drives a different level of devotion. There's some good stuff in 54. We go through the whole prisoner exchange that I had mentioned earlier. But the important thing that we learn in chapter 54 is the motivation of the Lamanites. And it says that we will wage a war which shall be eternal, either to the subjecting of the Nephites to our authority, or to their eternal extinction. And their meaning the Nephites, right? The Lamanites and Zoramites see this as really, there's only two possible outcomes for this. you will become our slaves, or we will kill every last one of you. And when you understand what you're up against, it certainly creates a different level of urgency from the perspective of the Nephites. No, I don't want to be a part of that. I don't. I would prefer not to. But it certainly makes, once you know what the motivation of your enemy is, it certainly allows you to make different decisions as you work through it. I'm skipping ahead to chapter 56. We see in chapter 56, Helaman exchanging letters with Moroni, talking about his boys, and there's some great stuff there. Verse 8, but I would not suffer them that they should break this covenant. He's basically saying to Moroni, like, we had all these people, but we're not going to use these people, but we are going to take their kids. God would strengthen us in as much as we should not suffer more because of the fulfillment of the oath which they had taken. It's this idea that while you're looking at this untapped labor force or fighting force, right here, what's the quote from Samuel Clemens? It's never wrong to do the right thing. And that's really what Helaman is saying here, is we're going to be fine is so long as we do the right thing. And the right thing by the people of Ammon is to not let them break their covenant with the Lord. And so we see that, right? In verse 16, yea, and they were depressed in body as well as in spirit, for they had, no, I want to skip that one. Sorry, that's not the one I was looking for. But that's real, the young men, right? There's something about that first moment, right? The naivety of the young in going to war and thinking that it's going to be glorious. And I've watched the Civil War, Ken Burns documentary, and you see all this pomp and circumstance and great excitement, this great adventure that's going to happen. And you see it in the letters and communications from both sides, the North and the South, and how exciting it's going to be. And then after that first battle, the Battle of Bull Run, suddenly both sides realized that this was going to be something different and more horrific than they ever could imagine. And it wasn't, the pomp and circumstance and the flags and the honor of. It was dirty, it was smelly, it was, in many cases, desperate, and hopeless. And yet, they still did their duty and still carried on. But you see that with the sons of Helaman. Hey, we're going off to war. We've got all these noble goals, and once it hits you in the face, that's when you start to see that 10,000-yard stare that so often happens with the soldiers when they've seen things that they don't want to talk about, and you don't want to ask them about, and you don't want to know what that is. And they can't communicate it to you anyway. But you can see that they've seen some stuff. And that's kind of what it is. They start to go through the battles, and they're nicked up, and they see things, and they smell things, and they do things that they never thought they would ever do, see or smell or hear. And you lose virtue in it. No matter how righteous your cause is, you still lose a bit of your innocence of your soul. Verse 47 of chapter 56. Now they never had fought, yet they did not fear death, and they did not think more upon the liberty, and they did think more upon the liberty of their fathers, and sorry, having a hard time reading. I'm going to start over. Now they never had fought, yet they did not fear death. And they did think more upon the liberty of their fathers than they did upon their lives. There's something bigger than me and my life. And in this case, it's the liberty of their fathers and their people that they focus on. And because of that, and because they understand the nature of this life, they're in a position where they don't fear death. And battle requires that. Many of the soldiers, you read like the Band of Brothers, read the book of Easy Company in World War II, and one of their commanders was a guy named Spears, and he had this philosophy that you accept that you're already dead. It just hasn't happened yet, and that allows you to function fully as a soldier. And there's a little bit of that here as I read this. Yea, they had been taught by their mothers that they did not doubt. I'm sorry, that if they did not doubt, God would deliver them. And they rehearsed unto me the words of their mother, saying, we do not doubt. Our mothers knew it. And I'm smiling because, for those of you who have been in the First Ward for a long time, can think back 15, 20 years, whenever it was, there was a Mother's Day, and they had 5 of the young men of our ward give Mother's Day talks. And by the third talk, we were, everyone was kind of keyed into the fact that all 5 of them had referenced this scripture as their talk. And so, it was good to go first, I guess, when you all basically have the same talk. And it's every time I read that, I think about that sacrament meeting and smile. So there it is. I've also thought about Neil A. Maxwell talks about this scripture. He was part of a Saints at War documentary that I watched many years ago, and he talked about, I believe it was at Iwo Jima, and he had found a place with his corps, battalion, team, whatever it was, group of guys, company, and they were in the shade, and they were in a little trench, and he heard a still small voice, and that voice said, get up and leave. And they didn't want to because it was shady and it was peaceful and they were trying to get some sleep. He drug them all out, and as soon as he did, mortars came in from the Japanese lines, and they would have all been dead. And he says, he had got a letter from his parents, or at that same time, halfway across the world, his mom woke his dad up and said, Neil's in trouble. And he quotes this scripture, and he said, who knows? But my mother knew. And so, so there it is, right? The power of a righteous home, the strength that comes if we teach our children to obey the commandments and to walk uprightly before the Lord. So some really good stuff if we look at it with these macro ideas of what is a believer's attitude towards war. Captain Moroni, in more than one case, talks about how he doesn't want this. But he will defend his people. He gives plenty of opportunity, plenty of quarter is granted. You see the difference in a righteous military leader, not just with Moroni and Pehoran, but the flip side with the enemy as well. The fact that that they're not willing to compromise, they're not willing to live together. They want an eternal war, as how it was described. We see this powerful influence that comes from being taught righteousness, and we see this resiliency in these people over and over, time and time again. And I think that that's relevant to us today. I mean, we're not in the middle of armed conflict. Well, some of us aren't. There's armed conflict going on throughout the world in many different places. But we are in the middle of a very strange time with a global pandemic and a lot of pent-up anxiety and angst about it. Some very real concerns for people who are at risk. Some very real concerns for those who aren't, who are now struggling with mental health and unemployment and and opioid addiction and raging alcoholism because of depression from being locked into our homes for weeks and months at a time. And there's so much going on. There's so many cards that are stacked against us. But our circumstance should not determine our testimony. Our circumstance should not determine, our devotion. Our circumstance, should not determine our attitude and our faithfulness. Our circumstance is just our circumstance. Our belief is our belief. Our testimony is our testimony, regardless of whether it's sunny or rainy, regardless of whether it's light or dark. And if we have that, and if we take our quiet times to shore up our defenses, shore up our testimony, our belief, when we're in the middle of a time like this, we have that to hold on to. And that's my encouragement to you, to just to take the opportunity to build and strengthen your testimonies on a daily basis. I close in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.